we're in the middle of this interlude of the trumpets. So we had the 6 trumpets, followed by chapters 10 and 11, which are our interludes. And so at the very end of chapter 11, we'll get the 7th trumpet again, which we may or may not get there. We'll just kind of see. In chapter 10, we are given the recommissioning of John to prophesy. That leads into chapter 11. Now, these chapters look different, but they're connected, right? Like we shouldn't, just because it says a big 11 doesn't mean that it's a different thing happening. All right, they are connected. The chapters and verses are added much, much later, and so we have to recognize that. In chapter 11, there's going to be metaphors that have traditionally been difficult to understand and to grasp, and so we will have to discuss them as they come. We must also remember that these metaphors come from the Old Testament, and their understanding will rely upon our understanding of the Old Testament, especially the way the Jews of John's day understood those passages as well. Then we'll be able to hopefully get a better grasp of what is happening. So if someone wants to read chapter 11, verses 1 through 13, that would be awesome.
I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and was told, "Go and measure the temple of God, the altar, and count the worshipers there. But exclude the outer court. Do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months, and I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. If anyone tries to harm them, fire comes from their mouths and devours their enemies. This is how anyone who wants to harm them must die. These men have power to shut up the sky so that it will not rain during the time they are prophesying, and they have power to turn the waters into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want. Now when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the abyss will attack them and overpower and kill them. Their bodies will lie in the streets of the great city, which is
figuratively.
Yeah, whatever that word, I can't say it. Called Sodom and Egypt. There also their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, men from every people, tribe, language, and nation will gaze on their bodies and refuse to them burial. The inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and will celebrate by sending each other gifts, because those 2 prophets are tormented those who lived on the earth. But after the 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and terror struck those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud, while their enemies looked on. At that very hour there was a severe earthquake, and 1/10 of the city collapsed. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the survivors were terrified and gave glory to God of heaven.
All right. Yay. Okay, there are 5 major interpretations to the passage that we just read, or that Roger just read. And so we need to kind of understand these to kind of decide which one is probably the best option. The first is what's called the dispensationalist futurist view. They view everything as literal. So 42 months, 3.5 years, which is 1/2 of the tribulation period. There are 2 different formats for the 3.5 years in chapter 11, and combined they get 7 years. Additionally, they tend to read all the verses literally. It's a literal time period, a literal temple, a literal city, and we've already talked about significantly that how should we not read Revelation literally. So we do have to pause and say, okay, maybe this isn't the best option. The next is what's called the preterist view. And preterists also view it literally, but that it's literally talking about Jerusalem pre-AD 70. And that what's being discussed is the destruction of Jerusalem in particular. There's lots of reasons to not hold to this view, mainly because John probably writes after AD 70. So probably not a preterist view, although there are some merits to that view in general. Another is a futurist view. Now, this is different than the dispensationalist future. The futurists do read it figuratively, but they read that most of this is talking about ethnic Israel. So the idea of temple, altar, and worshipers are a reference to ethnic Israel that finds salvation in the final days, while the outer court is a reference to unbelieving Israel not being saved. So it is talking about the future, and they believe that ethnic Israel will play a major part in the last days. Which again, there's lots of things to discuss there. We just don't have time to discuss it all. Then there's two idealist views. They both will read it figuratively. The main discussion is who's the inner court and who's the outer court. Okay, and that's kind of the futurists also in that discussion. Who's the inner court? Who's the outer court? For those that are idealists, everything's figurative, and so the inner court is spiritual Israel, and that John is writing to the apostate church. So the church that is compromising with the world is that option. Lastly, the last one says, again, figuratively, but it's talking about the heavenly church versus the earthly church. Which one you choose, I don't necessarily care. I do tend to not read literally, but these are just semantics at this point in time, these last three. Does ethnic Israel play a factor? Are we talking about a heavenly church versus an earthly church? Are we talking about apostate church versus faithful? I don't know the answer to that. But we should read it probably figuratively and try to figure out what John is communicating with the images that he's using. I do lean towards 4 and 5 because I'm not so much a futurist in general. So the first metaphor appears in verses 1 and 2, and it is highly influenced from Ezekiel chapter 40 through 48. This is the literary mechanic that John wishes to employ. And so we have to look at Ezekiel 40 through 48. Ezekiel's book in general, if you've never read it, this is Tony's super summary, okay? Ezekiel is living in Babylon when he's writing this, and he gets a series of visions. He's told to do some weird stuff, okay? Just to kind of talk about what is going to happen. Like he builds a replica of Jerusalem and plays like with battle sieges and says, this is what's going to happen to Israel. They're going to be conquered, or Jerusalem's going to be conquered. And that's just like the bare minimum of the weird stuff that Ezekiel does, okay? Anyway, one of the things that he talks a lot about is God's glory. And so in the early stages of Ezekiel, he gets his vision of the temple, and he sees all the things that the Israelites are doing. They're worshiping the sun god in the temple courts. They're sacrificing to the Ashtoreths and Baals. They're doing all this stuff in the temple at the same time worshiping God, right? So they're blending their worship. And so what Ezekiel says is that God's glory leaves the temple and it starts off by hovering over Israel, and then Ezekiel gets a vision of what is Jerusalem. And he gets a vision of what's happening there, and then God's glory leaves Jerusalem and goes to the Mount of Olives. And then after another set of vision, it leaves the Mount of Olives as well. So what Ezekiel 40 through 48 is talking about is the return of God's glory to a great extent. So the final chapters discuss a return of God's presence to the people. And in there, Ezekiel is given a measuring rod and told to go and measure the temple and the city. All right, and kind of part of that is to show that God's presence was with his people and they would come back. A second part of that is the measuring the temple was designed to create a barrier between what was previously contaminated the temple court and required its destruction in the first place. So they were supposed to be creating this barrier within that vision to keep out the things that contaminated in the first place. And so he has that idea here. And we see some of that idea in what John says, the outer courts and the inner courts. There's a barrier of some sort in there. With that in mind, we should hesitate to interpret the outer court as a provenance for idolatry. And part of that is understanding the temple of God in the New Testament. When we look at the New Testament's view of the temple of God, the temple is not ever really focused on as the temple in Jerusalem, right? Like, yeah, the temple is there, but the apostles or the disciples, when they're with Jesus, they turn to Jesus and say, Jesus, look at how beautiful this temple is. And what's Jesus' response? Do you remember? Yeah, this is going to be destroyed. Don't worry about this, right? Like his response is, we should not be focused on this aspect of things. And then he goes off and he tells about that destruction that's to come. And so the temple is not that important. The temple structure is not that important in the New Testament. We do see a couple of passages that kind of explain this. So Jesus says that. Paul has a couple of passages, though, that are important. So in 1 Corinthians 3:16, he says, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? In his second letter to the Corinthians, he writes, what agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God. In Ephesians 2:21, he says, in him the whole building is being joined together and rises to become a holy temple to the Lord. And so the physical temple doesn't really play a factor for Christians in the New Testament. And so for John then to be talking about a temple here seems a little strange. And so we have to kind of pause and say, is he talking about a lot of, especially dispensationalists will say there's going to be a rebuilding of the temple. And I always ask this question, what is the purpose of that? Right? Like, what would be the purpose of rebuilding a temple? Not to meet with God, because God already meets with us, right? Through Jesus and the Spirit inside us. It's not to offer up sacrifices, because there's one sacrifice done and completed. Exactly. Like, I mean, what is the purpose of that? And so I just don't see a reason to try to include that here, if that makes sense. Let's see. In the book of Revelation, we do again get this idea of the temple of God. Anytime the temple is used in Revelation, it is used of the heavenly temple, except for here, and maybe in 3:12.
Maybe next Sunday I'll make it to Sunday school.
Yeah, sorry to hear that.
Sorry too.
The only time the words temple of God is used is in these two verses. And so I think that John's moving away from the physical city of Jerusalem to the spiritual city and the people. And we can probably safely assume that what is being measured is the people of God and the worshipers under the altar. That's what I think we probably are talking about in this measurement. He actually doesn't tell us the measurement here, right? He just says he goes and measures. Later in these verses, he also talks about a time period. And what is that time period? In verses 1 and 2? 42 months. What does that equal? 3.5 years. Good job. All right. All these numbers equal 3.5 for whatever reason. Where does 3.5 years come from? We talked about last week. No. Although that is interesting that he was roughly 3.5 years. Nope. Nope. It actually comes from Daniel. Daniel talks about 3.5. 70 weeks, 3.5 weeks at the end. All right, so it probably comes from Daniel. He's the first one that really mentions it. When John uses Daniel in this way, we do have to ask why. What are the purposes? And there seems to be three common interpretations. The first is general time of trial for believers. So maybe this 3.5 years is talking about a trial for believers. Sometimes in Daniel, it's also associated with Israel's Babylonian captivity. Even though it was longer than 3.5 years, that concept for the Jews of this time is the captivity of the Israelites. And then third, the Israelites also interpret it as the people that must pass before the time that must, I should say time, not people, the time that must pass before Israel's final redemption occurs. So anytime you read in Second Temple Judaism writings, this is what they kept on mentioning. In Revelation, it will be mentioned 4 times. We've read 2 of them. But they don't appear in the same formula. So sometimes it's 3.5 years. Sometimes it's 42 months. Sometimes it's 1,260 days. Same amount of time period. And we have to ask, are these different time periods or are they the same? What's that? I did just say they're the same. Some people say different, but again, they're trying to say different because they want to make 7 years out of it, right? But if there's 3.5 years, how much is that? Seven times 2, right? Make it easier. So do we have, are they, and so this is the point, like at some point in time, you have to make some of them equal to each other. And if you're going to do that already, then why not just make them all equal? And probably trying to communicate this idea of a trial of some period or a set amount of time. Like, I think that's what John's trying to get at with all of these. So then that gets us to the question, why does he choose 42 months? Maybe because of Jesus? Yeah, you said that earlier, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just, maybe.
Does 42 relate to something back in the Old Testament?
Absolutely it does. Do you know what?
Not entirely.
Okay. There's 2 possibilities in the Old Testament. First is the time that they're actually in the wilderness in Egypt. Now, usually we say, how long were they there? 40. It's a nice round number. But that actually doesn't start until the Israelites have been at Mount Sinai for a year and have gone up to the promised land and sent spies in and come back. That's when the 40-year judgment starts. And so
It took 2 years to get to Mount Sinai?
no, they were at Mount Sinai they took a couple months to get there. They were at Mount Sinai for a year and then a couple months. So based on Jewish way of counting, they were in the desert for actual 42 years. And so we usually say 40 because that's the judgment, but they're actually in the desert 42 years based on Jewish way of counting, which is interesting. Additionally, there's a guy by the name of Elijah who's going to appear. We got to talk about him in just a second. And Elijah's ministry lasted 42 months or 3.5 years. So we could probably take either one. We're not quite sure exactly, but we do have that, which makes it interesting that Jesus is about a 42-month period ministry as well. Daniel, for Daniel though, the 3.5 years is an attack upon the temple. So when you read Daniel 7 and he talks about this 3.5 years, it's really talking about Antiochus in particular, Antiochus Epiphanes' attack against the temple. And so if we see the temple not as a literal structure, but as the people of God, then this 3.5 years makes more sense as an attack against the people of God. There's another idea. The last concept is the idea of the holy city. One thing that we're going to see throughout Revelation, starting about this point, are the idea of two cities, right? So one city is Babylon, and the other city is Jerusalem. Now, when I say Jerusalem, I mean New Jerusalem, okay? Or spiritual Jerusalem, or heavenly Jerusalem versus spiritual Babylon, not real Babylon, right? Which is partly why he doesn't, we read it like, it says figuratively Sodom and Egypt and where they crucified the Lord. Why didn't he say Jerusalem there? He probably doesn't say it because he doesn't want us to get confused, okay? So we have this heavenly Jerusalem, this new Jerusalem. Really in Revelation, yeah. So we're going to see two odds. We're going to see two women in chapter 12, starting in chapter 12, right? There's going to be the bride of Christ versus the whore of Babylon, right? So we're going to see this dualism, this dichotomy that exists throughout the rest of Revelation. And so this is just the start of it.
Whenever he's told to write what you see, okay, if a brain surgeon was to tell me, I'm going to give you information, write what I tell you, I might not understand everything he's saying. Could it be too that some of this stuff only God knows what is behind it, and he's not actually thinking about this is what I mean, but this is God's giving me this information and I'm writing it down?
I mean, maybe, but what would be the purpose of God telling John to write something and tell people about it if they couldn't understand at least the idea
Understand
behind
it
it?
anyway.
Well, I'm not saying that we don't understand, but I'm saying that
If he wanted us to understand it clearly, why is it written like this?
Because it's the way Jews thought. Like, I think this is my thing. I really do believe that John's original audience probably had a better understanding than us. They understood what John was trying to
And why
communicate.
didn't they interpret it for us as the generation went on so we know what they mean?
Because we're Western in our thinking. And we're 2,000 years separated. What's that?
They thought Jesus was coming back before too much longer anyway.
Yeah.
my only thing was I was just thinking maybe sometime he thought, I'll write that down, but I wonder what that really means, you know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. Yeah. No, I mean, this is where I think it's important to know our Old Testament really. We can't throw the Old Testament out because, I mean, 3.5 years, sure, let's make it a tribulation period of 7 years and say Jesus is going to come back and we're not going to be here for those 7 years. And this book really then means nothing to anyone until they get to there. What's the point of that? Like, why have we kept it so long? You know, I really do think he meant something that we can interpret for our own lives. And this interlude here is yes, there's a lot of confusing aspects to it, but I think if we look at the Old Testament, we can gain something of what John's trying to communicate.
Yeah, and I'm not saying we can't. I just was wondering, you know.
Yeah. No, I think John includes it because it gave encouragement to those Christians that were dealing with it. And yeah, we're 2,000 years apart. Man, I wish he had made a commentary for it. Like, that would have been helpful. At times, yeah. I mean, the horse. I mean, we read about last week the horse with a lion's head and a scorpion tail or a snake tail. You know that. Yeah, that is. Maybe we need some of that drug. You know, so.
If he were to come back, we'd hospitalize him, that's all I'm
Yeah.
Would we not?
Is that your personal or professional opinion?
Professional. Someone wrote this today. Yeah.
I had someone tell me he was Jesus. I asked how his sister is doing. He's like,
Yeah, he said, I don't have
his sister. I mean, I know he does because she was in the hospital the week before.
Yeah.
He said, I'm Jesus Christ. See you next week.
So the holy city, I think, is probably going to be New Jerusalem, not necessarily like physical Jerusalem. Jerusalem's destroyed at this point. I think it's the looking forward to the new Jerusalem that's coming, that's being talked about here.
basically heaven.
That's a complicated question. Yes and no. We'll talk about it when we get to chapter 21 and 22. I'll just push it off for then. So, all right. So then we get to this last thing, the trampling of the outer courts. So what is the trampling of the outer courts? Because again, if we're talking about not a physical Jerusalem, but a spiritual Jerusalem, then we have to understand what does that mean. So this is the one thing we have to kind of decide. The outer courts is not always a bad thing, and the trampling of the outer courts is not always a bad thing. In fact, in Ezekiel 40 through 48, it's seen as a good thing. And so this is definitely a positive. So when we say that the holy city is the new Jerusalem, that Christians make up the heavenly city, a temple, then the inner courts and outer courts could simply be the difference between the heavenly church and the earthly church, where the heavenly church is protected by association with God, while the earthly church doesn't receive all of the same protections, right? Like if you're in heaven, you don't have to worry about being persecuted, right? You don't have to worry about slander. That stuff doesn't touch you. Whereas if you're on earth, all those things are very much real possibilities. And so I think that's probably where he's going with this. Again, there's lots of interpretations on what John means here. Which then gets us to the fun part, the two witnesses. So the question that we do have to ask is, how are the witnesses connected to the measuring? Okay, they are connected. John doesn't say anything about, I saw a new vision, or after these things, right? He just goes straight into, after the measurement comes the two witnesses. And so what I think what we're having here is God is present with his end time community to ensure their effectiveness in their prophetic witness within the world. So the measuring is there, God showing that he's going to be with them. And then we have these two witnesses that we do have to figure out who they are. And I would lean towards them being the church. So here we go. Who are the witnesses? What have you heard? What's the word on the street?
Are the witnesses the disciples?
Okay. That's one of the options. That's like the third option. We got to get the other ones first. All right, so here are some options. Moses and Elijah. Why would we say Moses and Elijah? They're on the Mount of Transfiguration, okay. They're to the key prophets, right? The first and the last in a lot of people's minds. Not exactly true, but at least in some minds. We also, in verse 6, some of the work that they do is imagery of those two guys, right? What does verse 6 say? Yep. So there you go. So Elijah prayed for rain to come and go. Moses turned water into blood and did the plagues. So that's one of the things. One thing to keep in mind, though, reincarnation is not a biblical concept. So we need to keep that in mind. So to say again, to say that these are anybody that's just born again probably is a bad concept. Now, we could say that they're resurrected. We just have to go into some of those things. Another thing is reincarnation is the idea that you have a child that's a boy, that's Moses, being born again. Whereas resurrection is his body comes back to life. Yep. Okay. Another option is Enoch and Elijah. Why these two guys? They didn't die. Only two people in the Old Testament who never died, right? Enoch is said to have been faithful to God to the point that he just was not there anymore because God took him away. And then Elijah is taken up in a whirlwind, right? So two guys that never died, and so maybe this gets away from reincarnation. They just come back from heaven, is kind of there. Paul and Peter. Why Paul and Peter?
Because they were disciples.
Paul was not a disciple. He was an apostle, though. But why Paul and not John?
I believe he was the Gentile.
Yeah, and Peter is considered the apostle to the Jew. Yeah, so maybe it's the fact that they're the two big pillars of the New Testament church. This is a preterist idea. There were two Jewish high priests killed in AD 68. And so if you think that this is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, then maybe the two high priest view is good. Another common one is that these are the Old and New Testaments, the two pillars. So I don't know that any of these are right. I do think that what John's trying to get at is the witness of the collective church. And so these two witnesses are there because of that. And here's some reasons why. First, they are called the lampstands, right? These are the two lampstands. Elsewhere in Revelation, the lampstands have stood for different churches or the people of God. Okay, especially Revelation chapter 1, Revelation chapter 4. Like they represent the people of God. So then that leads us to an important question. Why are there two here and not seven like what we find in the earlier? Two lampstands. Yeah. Why do they call it two lampstands, two witnesses, and not seven? If it's the whole people of God. Two's all you need, right? Numbers 35:30 says on the count of two witnesses, things can happen, right? Also, there's only two faithful churches. So when you read those 7 letters, only 2 of them are faithful. And so maybe it's a hint at that as well. Verse 7, we'll talk about a beast that makes war with the entire people of God, right? And it's a reference to Daniel 7:21. We'll actually, once we get to chapter 12, talk a lot more about it. But a beast that makes war with people, Satan's coming after the whole church, not just 2 random people, or even if they're 2 important people, right? Yeah.
The 2 faithful churches and like why number 2, that makes me think about where it says when 2 or more Christians meet, that is considered a church.
Okay, or at least Jesus is with them. Yeah.
Yes, okay, yeah. But that's what that made me think of.
So you think that it's going to be 2 churches?
No. I think John is using the number 2 just because of the symbolic nature of you need 2 witnesses. But they are representing the collective witness of the church. So the whole church, not Kentucky Road and Southside, but the church universal. So, in verses 9 through 13, there's mentioning of the unbelieving world seeing the defeat of the witnesses and rejoicing. Now, while that's certainly a possibility in today's world with instant news coverage, the likelihood that John was envisioning the internet back then is probably very slim. He is more than likely talking about the world rejoicing at the death of the church or at the perceived death of the church. And I think that our world would do such a thing today. So, I mean, I don't know that that's a far-fetched idea, and I think even in John's day, they would have rejoiced at such a thing. The prophecy, a fourth reason is the prophecy of 3.5 years is the same length for the trampling of the holy city, as well as the war with the woman in chapter 12, and with those being tabernacling in heaven, being oppressed in a later chapter. So while we might not be talking about different periods of time, the best way I think to read it is the same period of time. And so if we're talking about 3.5 years, then there's a lot of things that are connected to that. And it would make much more sense for this to be the church, since all the other ones are talking about the church. So these two witnesses have enduring this for 3.5 days or whatever, probably is collectively that idea. Additionally, Christians are called witnesses of Jesus throughout Revelation. Revelation 6:9, Revelation 12:11, Revelation 19:10, Revelation 24, just among a few of them. They are the ones that testify or witness to what Jesus has done. Additionally, the powers in verse 6 are given not to one or the other, but to both. So they're not exclusive. So we can't be talking about Moses and Elijah having two separate powers. Rather, we're talking about the collectiveness of this power. So that's where I go with. The witness is probably the collective church. We do see that the witnesses are in sackcloth. Why would they be in sackcloth? Sadness. Why are they sad?
I don't know, I missed that part of it.
They're gonna come bring plagues.
They're bringing plagues.
I'm thinking sadness for those like aren't believers.
Okay. So seriously, I think this is why we can't divorce chapter 10 from chapter 11, right? John is told to eat the scroll, and it tastes how? Sweet on his mouth, but bitter in his stomach, right? And I think that concept of the bitterness being the bitterness of what he has to say, the judgment that's a part of it, is associated with this idea of sackcloth. It falls back to judgment. So while we do have a message of judgment, we should not be rejoicing in that judgment, right? Like our goal as Christians shouldn't be to be happy that people are dying and going to hell. Like that's far from what is expected of us as people of God. We should be sad that our world is dying and going to hell. And it should empower us and encourage us to spread the news as fast as we can. Okay. Lastly, talks about olive trees. This comes from Zechariah 4:14. And Zechariah's vision, the two lampstands in the new temple are supplied by two olive trees. In verses 6 through 10 of Zechariah 4, we are told that though the building of the temple had begun, opposition from hostile powers halted the work. And the point of the vision is to assure that though people oppose the temple, divine presence will help it be completed. Similarly, we can say the same thing here. The witness of the church is designed to build it completely, right? Like we are being built up into the temple of God, as Paul says in Ephesians. And the question of the saints in Revelation 6:14-15 is how long until we are vindicated? And the answer was until your number is completed. And so I think what we have here is that vision being brought back, repeating by John, so that we know that we are talking about the people of God, not necessarily certain individuals. Oh wow. It's late. All right, we're not going to get to the seventh seal. We'll try to get this one done. We'll go a little bit faster. All right, verse 5, we're told that the church is protected spiritually, right? If anyone tries to harm them, fire comes from the mouth, devours their enemy. Again, fire-breathing people is probably not a reality, but the church is protected spiritually by God. We do need to remember what Jesus said in Matthew 16. He said, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail, overcome it, right? And so while people try to hurt and kill the church, They cannot. And so I don't think this is a literal fire. I think it's a spiritual protection for the church. That does not necessarily mean that individuals will not suffer for their witness. And I would even say that while the church might diminish in one part, it doesn't mean that it doesn't grow stronger in another part. And I think we've seen that throughout history, how the church might grow lesser in Jerusalem, but grows stronger in Rome, or grows weaker in Rome and grows stronger in Northern Europe, or grows weaker in Northern Europe and grows stronger in America, and so on and so forth. We're seeing that even now as it grows weaker in America, it's growing stronger in East Asian cultures. And I think we should recognize that. So even though it may diminish, it will survive. And so while we might have despair for the church in America, we can know that the church universal will remain strong. Easily, if it isn't already. Sometimes, yep. And usually it's culture based, if that makes sense. So they're not necessarily coming to Americans; they're coming to Chinese people living in America, if that makes sense.
Brother Pelfrey said in that statement when Mike was in Bible college that someday America would be the mission.
Yeah, very much so. In verse 6, we do have Moses and Elijah as literary devices. I think that they are used as a mechanic rather than speaking to them being literally those two witnesses. Elijah did have a 3.5-year ministry. He prayed for 3.5 years that it would not rain, and then it would rain. Moses' Egyptian ministry included turning water into blood and striking them with plagues. Again, not literally these two men. The Bible does not teach reincarnation, but resurrection. We've already talked about that. So, and so what I think we have here is the church has the power of these men's ministries, and what are their ministries? Why did they have these powers? What were they trying to do?
Moses was the one that led the nation of Israel out of Egypt to the promised land.
Yeah, and so why did he have the plagues? I've answered this a couple of times.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
You're good.
That was because God was trying to get people to realize that he was the Messiah.
Okay.
And of course, it took, whether they would have still done anything if he'd only had one plague, I don't think so. But
Right. So we've talked about this a couple of times. I did do a sermon on it too. So hopefully you've now you get to see how much you retain. So three reasons for the Egyptian plagues, and they're the same 3 reasons why Elijah has his 3.5-year ministry. Okay. First is he was combating idolatry, right? So these plagues are attacks against Egyptian idolatry. Elijah, why does he pray in the first place? Because the northern kingdom is worshiping Baals and Ashtoreths, right? They also to harden hearts. And so the Egyptians, even though they saw the plagues, they were hardened. In Elijah's ministry, he gets to Mount Carmel and he asks the people, choose this day who you're going to serve. Is it Yahweh that is God, or is it Baal who is God? And what is their response? To be silent. They are silent. They don't choose. After 3.5 years of no rain, they choose not to answer. Right? And then also to combat compromise with the world, right? You can't serve both God and idols. It's one or the other. And all these ministries are about that. And I think the ministry and the witness of the church is supposed to be that as well. Combating idolatry in people's lives, hardening hearts of those who are unwilling to turn from idols, and to teach God's people not to compromise with the world. Verse 7, I have these final verses. These final verses speak of a dark reality of our future. So once the testimony is over, and so we're probably getting to the end. So what you're probably seeing is like the last days, literally, like the final periods of time. All right. Once the testimony is over, once the church's message no longer matters. When does the church message no longer matter? When Yes, once every decision has been made, those who have decided to believe have, right? For the saints, how long? Once your numbers are completed, right? So once our message no longer matters, that's when the beast comes, attacks, and overpowers and kills. And again, the church will seem dead, right? But what happens?
Church is all that's left.
What was that? Yeah. We do talk about, we will talk about beasts in chapter 12, so I don't want to talk about it too much here, but it is the one that will finally seem to conquer. Then verse 8 talks about a couple of things. It says the bodies lay in a public square of the great city. And so we have to ask, what is the great city? Yeah, it is not Jerusalem. Again, there's two cities, right? The holy city and the great city. The holy city is New Jerusalem, spiritual Jerusalem, and the great city is always a reference to Babylon in Revelation. Now, this is the first time that it's mentioned here, and so there's three references that are kind of given to help explain what this is. First is Sodom, and what was Sodom known for? Oh, a whole bunch of answers there. Okay. I have here their hedonistic ways, right? They're hedonists, all about pleasure in themselves. Egypt, what is Egypt known for in particular? Idolatry, right? And then the last one, he doesn't say the name, right? But it's Jerusalem. And again, just so we don't get confused with New Jerusalem later on. But why, what does Jerusalem represent? Yeah, rejection or opposition to God's Messiah, right? Because what is he doesn't say Jerusalem, he says where they crucified the Lord. Okay? And so we have these three references. And so when you see a culture that's hedonistic, idolatrous, and in opposition to God's Messiah, it's probably Babylon. And again, I don't think it's just one Babylon in history. I think Babylon continues to exist. And we have to ask ourselves, what is Babylon right now? And it's going to be defined by these three ideas: hedonism, idolatry, opposition to God's people, or God's Messiah. We do see that they lie there for 3.5 days, not 3.5 years, so we have a shortening, and again, why the shortening? Probably to just let us know that the victory of the beast is short compared to the church's victory, right? Or even the church's witness. They are not given burial, which in the ancient world is a pejorative, meaning that we really don't like you, and so we're not even going to let you bury your dead. No honor given to you, at least, right? And instead, they celebrate. The world rejoices. They give gifts. The message is, and why are they celebrating? What does it say, the reason for their celebration there in verse 10? Yeah, right? They tormented us. How are they tormented? How is the witness of the church tormenting to people? Yeah, so I have here the message is convicting, right? All right, wages war in the minds of people, and people that really don't like to be told that they're wrong or that they're bad or that what they're doing is not okay. Like, that can be convicting, and they get defensive very, very easily. And I think we see that, right? And then I think verses 11 through 12 is the last day, right? It says we are summoned to be with God in front of the whole world. A couple of things happen as a result of that in verse 13. There's earthquakes. Earthquakes are generally signs of the final day. Okay, we see it throughout Revelation used in this way. In this judgment, a tenth of the city collapses, 7,000 is killed. The survivors, what does it say that they do? Terrified and give glory to God. Now, that's something that we do have to understand. What does it mean to be in terror and to glory and give glory to God? It does not necessarily mean that they have faith. Okay? For example, Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 of Daniel, is given this vision. Daniel comes and explains it, and the result is Nebuchadnezzar glorifies God. Did Nebuchadnezzar stop worshiping all of his other idols?
No, he just realizes the power of God.
Right, and so he adds God to everything else, right? I think we could also say the same thing in Jonah chapter 1, right? The sailors toss Jonah overboard, the storm stops, and it says that they were terrified and gave glory to God. Probably doesn't mean that they started worshiping God only. And so just because they're giving glory to God doesn't necessarily mean that they have faith in God. And I think we probably see this, right? The result of everything that they see leaves them with no place but to acknowledge who God is.
Do they do that out of fear?
Yeah, I mean, they're terrified. I mean, you get to a spot where if God does something just stupendous, where you're just, there's no way we can deny it at this point in time. And I think when we go to be with God collectively, there's just no way of denying it. I think Paul talks about this as well in Philippians 2, 9 through 11, right? At the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that he is Lord. It's going to happen, and this is how I say it. It's going to happen one way or another. You're going to bow down to Jesus. You're going to declare him as Lord. The question is, do you do it willfully or against your will? And I think that's kind of what John is probably discussing here. So, okay, so what can we learn from chapter 11?
We need to keep spreading the word.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep allowing our witness to do what it needs to do.
The church is always going to stand, it's always going to be protected. Not going to die.
Now, you may die, but
Right.
the church itself.
The church itself will live on. The bride of Christ.
And when I say you, I mean you collectively, you individually. I have on here, God is present with his church as they witness to the unbelieving world about the impending judgment that's coming. And so I think that's what John's trying to do. Again, it's connected to chapter 10 where he's commissioned to take these words of judgment and go and tell the world. And this isn't just a John commission. This is a commission for all Christians. Like, something's coming. And it's our responsibility to let people know that God is going to judge the world, and we don't want them to be on the wrong side of that judgment. Or at least I don't. And I think that's what John wants us to understand. So,